Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are tracking a world that feels like it's spinning faster than anyone can keep up with. From the brink of war in the Middle East, to a billion-dollar Chinese industrial juggernaut quietly reshaping global markets, to a World Cup ticket frenzy that's exposing just how desperate people are for something, anything, to feel hopeful about.
I'm Maya Clarity, and we have a packed show tonight. We're going to take you behind the headlines on 5 stories that, on the surface, look disconnected, but when you pull the threads, you start to see a pattern. Power consolidating. Diplomacy fraying. And ordinary people caught in the middle, whether they're watching missiles fly or just trying to buy a ticket to a football match.
Let's start where the stakes are arguably highest tonight, the rapidly deteriorating diplomatic landscape between the United States and Iran. Because what we're seeing unfold right now isn't just another chapter of tension. It may be the closing of a door that took decades to open.
That's right. And we need people to understand what it means when that door closes. Because the consequences don't stay in Geneva or Washington. They ripple out to energy markets, to military deployments, to the price you pay at the gas pump, and ultimately to whether young men and women get sent to fight in another conflict in the Middle East.
So let's get into it. Story number 1 tonight. Iran's ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva came out on Tuesday with a statement that diplomatic observers are calling one of the most blunt assessments we've heard from Tehran in recent memory. According to reporting from Middle East Eye, the ambassador expressed deep skepticism about the usefulness of continuing negotiations with the United States. Not just reluctance, doubt about whether the entire exercise of talking has any value left.
And Alex, the language here matters enormously. This isn't a junior official floating a trial balloon. This is Iran's ambassador to the UN in Geneva, one of the most senior diplomatic posts Tehran maintains in the Western world. When someone at that level publicly questions the utility of negotiations, that's not posturing. That's a signal. That's Tehran telling the international community, we are running out of reasons to stay at the table.
Let's put this in context for our viewers. The US and Iran have been locked in this cycle for years: sanctions, counter-sanctions, back-channel talks, the collapse of the JCPOA nuclear deal, intermittent hostilities through proxy forces across the region. Every time it looks like there might be a path forward, something derails it. And now, with the current administration taking an increasingly hawkish posture, Tehran appears to be calculating that diplomacy is no longer delivering results.
What's particularly striking is the timing. This statement didn't come in a vacuum. It comes at a moment when the US has been ramping up maximum pressure tactics, expanded sanctions, military posturing in the Gulf, and rhetoric that leaves very little room for the kind of face-saving compromises that diplomacy requires. When you back a sovereign nation into a corner publicly, you make it politically impossible for their leaders to come to the table without looking like they're capitulating.
And that's the dangerous game, Maya. Because the alternative to diplomacy isn't peace. The alternative to diplomacy is escalation. Every senior foreign policy expert will tell you the same thing: when talking stops, the risk of miscalculation skyrockets. A naval incident in the Strait of Hormuz. A drone strike that goes wrong. A proxy attack that crosses an unspoken red line. These are the scenarios that keep defense analysts up at night.
The question our viewers should be asking is, who benefits from the collapse of US-Iran diplomacy? Because it's certainly not the Iranian people, who are suffering under sanctions. And it's not the average American, who has no interest in another Middle Eastern conflict. The beneficiaries are defense contractors who profit from tension, regional rivals who prefer a weakened Iran, and political actors on both sides who use external threats to consolidate domestic power.
That's the calculus that rarely makes it into the headlines. Follow the money, follow the power, and you'll find your answer every time. Now, this connects directly to our second story tonight, because the question of presidential war powers is back in the spotlight, and the framing should concern every single American regardless of party.
Absolutely. Al Jazeera is reporting on statements asserting that the US president has the authority to act against imminent threats to the United States. Now, on its face, that sounds reasonable. Of course, a president should be able to respond to an imminent attack. But the devil, as always, is in the definition. What constitutes imminent? Who decides? And what are the checks on that power?
This is a conversation that has been building since the post-9/11 era, and frankly, it's one that Congress has repeatedly failed to have honestly with the American people. The authorization for use of military force, the AUMF, passed in 2001 has been stretched, reinterpreted, and expanded by every administration since to justify military action in countries and against groups that didn't even exist when it was written. We're now a quarter century into a legal framework that was designed for a specific moment and has become a blank check.
And here's what concerns me, Alex. When you pair this assertion of presidential authority with the collapse of diplomatic channels, like what we're seeing with Iran, you create a scenario where military action becomes not just possible, but politically convenient. If there's no diplomatic off-ramp, and the president has broad authority to act on perceived threats, the barrier to conflict drops dramatically.
Let's be specific about what imminent threat has meant in practice. Under the Obama administration, the definition was expanded to include situations where a target presented a continuing threat, not necessarily an attack that was about to happen in hours or days, but a general ongoing danger. That interpretation was used to justify drone strikes across multiple countries. Under subsequent administrations, that elastic definition has only stretched further.
And the constitutional question remains fundamentally unresolved. Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war. But modern presidents have effectively circumvented that through executive action, citing inherent authority as commander-in-chief. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 was supposed to be the guardrail, requiring congressional notification within 48 hours and withdrawal within 60 days without congressional approval. But enforcement has been virtually non-existent.
So when we hear that the president has the authority to act on imminent threats, we need to ask, is this a statement of constitutional principle, or is it laying the groundwork for something specific? Because in the current climate, with Iran pulling back from talks, with tensions across the Middle East at a boiling point, that assertion of authority takes on a very different weight.
The American public deserves transparency on this. If military action is being contemplated, Congress needs to be involved. The debate needs to happen in the open, not behind classified briefings that select committee members receive and can't discuss. Democracy doesn't function when the most consequential decisions a nation can make, war and peace, are made by a handful of people in a situation room.
Well said. Now, let's shift gears, but not as far as you might think. Because our third story tonight takes us to the world of sport, and specifically to the T20 Cricket World Cup, where South Africa's unbeaten Proteas are set to face a formidable New Zealand side in Wednesday's semi-final. And Maya, I know some of our viewers might wonder why an investigative news show is covering cricket. But stay with us, because this story is about far more than what happens on the pitch.
It really is, Alex. As reported by Al Jazeera, South Africa come into this semi-final with a perfect record, unbeaten through the group stages and beyond. They're facing a New Zealand team known for their all-round talent, a squad that consistently punches above its weight on the global stage. On the sporting merits alone, this is a compelling matchup.
But here's the bigger picture. South Africa's journey in international cricket has always been inseparable from the country's political story. This is a nation that was banned from international sport for over 2 decades because of apartheid. When they returned, cricket became one of the most powerful symbols of reconciliation and national identity. The Proteas don't just play for themselves, they carry the weight of a country's ongoing struggle with its past and its future.
And the transformation debate in South African cricket remains one of the most heated in world sport. The question of representation, who gets selected, who gets opportunities in development programs, who runs the administrative bodies, is a mirror of the broader challenges South Africa faces with inequality and access. A deep run in a World Cup has enormous implications for funding, for public support, and for the political will to continue transformation efforts.
New Zealand, meanwhile, represents something entirely different on the global sporting stage. A country of barely 5 million people that consistently competes at the highest levels across multiple sports. Their cricket program is a model of efficiency and player development, and their culture of sportsmanship, the way they carry themselves win or lose, has earned them respect worldwide.
What I find fascinating is how cricket, more than almost any other sport, reflects geopolitical relationships. The International Cricket Council's power structures, the distribution of broadcasting revenue, which nations get to host major tournaments, all of it maps onto broader questions of economic and political influence. The fact that this World Cup is generating massive global attention is both a sporting story and an economic one.
And speaking of economics and global attention, that brings us perfectly to our fourth story, and this one is a big deal that is flying under the radar in Western media. Zoomlion, the Chinese manufacturing and heavy equipment giant, looks set for what Electrek is calling a breakout year, having already shipped approximately 15,000 units with a combined value of around 8.5 billion yuan, that's roughly $1.2 billion, and we're barely into March.
Let that sink in for a moment. $1.2 billion in deliveries, and we haven't even finished the first quarter of 2026. That is a staggering pace. Zoomlion isn't a company most Western consumers have heard of, but in the construction equipment and industrial machinery space, they are rapidly becoming one of the most important players on the planet.
And here's what makes this story matter beyond the business pages. Zoomlion's growth is part of a much larger pattern of Chinese industrial firms expanding aggressively into global markets, often with equipment that is significantly cheaper than Western competitors, backed by state financing mechanisms that make them attractive to buyers in developing nations across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America.
According to Electrek's reporting, this isn't just about traditional construction equipment anymore. Zoomlion has been making major moves into electric and new energy machinery, electric excavators, electric cranes, battery-powered forklifts. They're positioning themselves at the intersection of two massive global trends, infrastructure development and the energy transition. And they're doing it at a scale and price point that Western manufacturers are struggling to match.
This raises critical questions about industrial policy and economic competition. For decades, Western nations, particularly the United States and European countries, dominated the global heavy equipment market. Companies like Caterpillar, John Deere, Liebherr, and Komatsu were the default choices for major infrastructure projects worldwide. What Zoomlion's numbers suggest is that dominance is being challenged in a fundamental way.
And the geopolitical implications are significant. When a Chinese company supplies the cranes that build a port in Kenya, the excavators that dig a mine in Indonesia, or the forklifts that operate a warehouse in Brazil, that creates economic relationships and dependencies that have strategic value. This is the Belt and Road Initiative manifesting in the most concrete possible way, literally building the physical infrastructure of the developing world.
The response from Western manufacturers and governments has been mixed. We've seen tariffs, we've seen accusations of unfair subsidies, we've seen efforts to restrict technology transfer. But the fundamental challenge remains: if Zoomlion can deliver comparable equipment at a significantly lower price point, and they're also leading on electrification, the market is going to respond to that regardless of political preferences.
What I want our viewers to understand is that this isn't just a trade story. It's a story about the future of global industrial power. The countries and companies that build the world's infrastructure have enormous influence over how that infrastructure is designed, what standards it meets, whose technology it relies on, and ultimately, whose rules govern the global economy. 15,000 units shipped in 2 months tells you something profound about where that power is migrating.
And the electrification angle is particularly significant. If Zoomlion captures a dominant share of the global market for electric construction equipment, they'll be setting the technical standards, controlling the supply chains, and building the service networks that lock in customers for decades. First-mover advantage in this space is enormously valuable, and right now, by the numbers, they're moving first and fast.
This is exactly the kind of story that gets buried under the day's political drama but has far more lasting consequences for people's lives. The decisions being made in boardrooms in Changsha, China, where Zoomlion is headquartered, are going to shape employment, trade balances, and economic opportunity across the world for the next generation.
Absolutely. Now, our fifth and final story tonight brings all of these threads together in a way that's almost poetic. The FIFA World Cup 2026, being hosted across the United States, Mexico, and Canada, is experiencing a ticket frenzy that Al Jazeera reports has seen demand oversubscribed by more than 30 times. But this isn't just a story about football fever. It's a story about what happens when a global spectacle collides with a world in crisis.
30 times oversubscribed, Alex. Let that number land. For every ticket available, 30 people want one. That's not just high demand, that's a reflection of how desperately the world wants a moment of collective joy, of shared experience, of something that isn't war or economic anxiety or political dysfunction. The World Cup has always been the biggest single-event spectacle on Earth, but this level of demand in this global climate tells a deeper story.
And Al Jazeera's reporting highlights two critical tensions. First, pricing. With demand this extreme, ticket prices are becoming a flashpoint. The question of who can actually afford to attend, versus who gets priced out, is a microcosm of the inequality that defines our era. Football has always been called the people's game, but when tickets are allocated through systems that favor those with the fastest internet connections and the deepest wallets, that populist identity gets tested.
The second tension is global unrest itself. Al Jazeera specifically notes that the ticket frenzy is unfolding amid global instability. Think about what that means practically. Fans from countries under sanctions may face travel restrictions. Supporters from conflict zones may not be able to get visas. The geopolitical map doesn't pause for a sporting tournament, it shapes who gets to participate and who gets excluded.
And let's talk about the host nations. The United States, Mexico, and Canada are hosting this tournament at a moment when relations between these three countries are more complicated than they've been in decades. Trade disputes, immigration policy, border security, these are live political issues that will form the backdrop of every match played. The idea that sport exists in a bubble separate from politics has always been a fiction, but this World Cup may expose that fiction more starkly than any before it.
There's also the economic dimension. FIFA World Cups generate billions in economic activity, stadium construction, tourism, hospitality, broadcasting rights. But the distribution of the economic benefit is notoriously uneven. Host cities invest enormous public resources in infrastructure and security, and the returns often flow disproportionately to FIFA, to corporate sponsors, and to the hospitality industry rather than to local communities. With demand this high, the pressure to maximize revenue extraction will be intense.
And here's where I want to connect the dots across everything we've covered tonight. Because when you step back, what you see is a world where the institutions meant to manage conflict, diplomacy, international law, democratic accountability, are under strain everywhere. Iran doubts the value of talking. Presidential war powers expand without meaningful oversight. Global industrial competition intensifies outside existing frameworks. And even something as joyful as a World Cup becomes a site of economic and geopolitical tension.
That pattern, Alex, is what we should be paying attention to. It's not that any one of these stories is unprecedented. It's that taken together, they reveal a global order that is fraying at multiple points simultaneously. The post-World War II architecture of international institutions, diplomatic norms, and multilateral cooperation, the system that, for all its flaws, has prevented great power conflict for 8 decades, is being tested like never before.
And the thread that runs through every single one of these stories is accountability, or rather, the lack of it. When Iran's ambassador questions the value of diplomacy, he's essentially saying, the rules-based order isn't delivering for us. When presidential authority expands without congressional check, that's accountability failing. When a Chinese industrial giant reshapes global markets while competitors cry foul about subsidies, that's the international trade system failing to adjudicate fairly. When World Cup tickets become luxury goods that exclude ordinary fans, that's FIFA failing its stated mission.
And this is where it comes back to all of you watching tonight. Because accountability doesn't just flow from institutions, it flows from citizens. From voters. From consumers. From people who refuse to accept the framing that these are distant, abstract problems that don't affect their lives. Every one of these stories connects to choices that are being made on your behalf, often without your knowledge or consent.
The Iran diplomacy story isn't just about Tehran and Washington. It's about whether your tax dollars fund another war or fund schools and hospitals. The war powers story isn't abstract constitutional law, it's about whether your elected representatives have a say in whether your children get deployed overseas. The Zoomlion story isn't just business news, it's about whether there will be manufacturing jobs in your community in 10 years or whether that economic capacity migrates overseas.
And the World Cup story, yes, even the football, is about what kind of world we're building. One where shared experiences bring people together across borders, or one where even joy gets gatekept by wealth and geopolitics. These aren't separate questions. They're all the same question, asked in different arenas: who has power? Who benefits? And who's being left behind?
That's the Truth Report standard, folks. We don't just tell you what happened today. We tell you why it happened, who made it happen, and what it means for you. Because the news isn't a series of disconnected events, it's a system. And until you see the system, you can't change it.
Before we go tonight, I want to leave our viewers with this thought. The Iranian ambassador's skepticism about diplomacy should alarm us, not because Iran is right or wrong, but because the failure of diplomacy has consequences measured in human lives. The assertion of unchecked presidential military authority should alarm us, not as a partisan issue, but as a democratic one. The rise of Zoomlion should wake us up, not to fear, but to the reality that the global economic landscape is shifting beneath our feet, and we need strategies that go beyond tariffs and rhetoric.
And the World Cup, with all its complications, should remind us that the hunger for connection, for celebration, for something bigger than our individual struggles, is one of the most powerful forces on Earth. 30 times oversubscribed. That's not just demand for tickets. That's demand for hope. And our job, as journalists, as citizens, as human beings, is to make sure that hope isn't exploited by the powerful at the expense of the rest of us.
That's our show for tonight. We'll be following every one of these stories in the days and weeks ahead. The Iran situation in particular bears very close watching. When diplomatic channels close, events can accelerate rapidly, and we owe it to you to be ahead of the curve, not chasing it.
If tonight's show made you think, share it. If it made you uncomfortable, good, that means we're doing our job. Truth doesn't always feel comfortable, but it's always necessary. I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Stay informed, stay critical, and we'll see you next time on Truth Report. Good night.